The committee meets today to receive testimony on space organization, policy, and programs, and I'd like to thank the very distinguished panel of witnesses for agreeing to testify before us today. Space-based capabilities are integral to the way our military operates and our society functions. As previous hearings in this subcommittee have documented, our adversaries are developing increasingly sophisticated ways to attack U.S. space assets and exploit the domain for their own purposes. General Hyten, General Raymond's predecessor and the current STRATCOM commander, told us just last month that space is a warfighting domain just like air, ground, maritime, and cyber, and we must normalize how we plan and operate in space. This new environment requires a flexible and an innovative military space enterprise capable of overcoming an ever-changing threat picture and rapidly delivering capabilities to the warfighter. However, the work of numerous reviews and commissions suggests there is a deep gap between the space enterprise that we need and the one that we have. For example, the Rumsfeld Commission concluded in 2001 that the Department of Defense is not yet arranged or focused to meet the national security space needs of the 21st century. More recently, a study by the GAO, directed by this subcommittee in 2015, concluded that DoD space leadership responsibilities are fragmented and spread across approximately 60 stakeholder organizations, from DoD to the Executive Office of the President to the intelligence community and civilian agencies. 8 of the 60 stakeholders have acquisition responsibilities, 11 are responsible for oversight, and 6 are involved in setting requirements for defense space programs. I question whether such an arrangement can meet the nation's needs in space, and I look forward to hearing our witnesses' views on how the current architecture can be improved. As we examine the organizational structure of the space enterprise, it is equally important that we ensure it receives the necessary personnel and resources. A recent study by the Department of Defense Office of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, or CAPE, noted that funding for space procurement and research and development are both at or near 30-year lows. Additionally, my colleague on the House Armed Services Committee, Congressman Rogers, has noted that out of the 37 nominees in March on the Air Force promotion list, from colonels to one-star generals, none of the nominees were career space professionals, like General Hyten, General Raymond, and Lieutenant General Greaves were at the point in their career. Both of these statements call into question whether the Department is appropriately prioritizing space. Let me again thank the witnesses for their service and for testifying today, and I now recognize the ranking member, Senator Donnelly, for any opening remarks he'd like to make.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to start by thanking all our witnesses for being here today and thanking you for calling this hearing on such an important subject. Secretary Wilson and General Goldfein, your presence here today sends a powerful message on the importance of these issues to our national security. Thanks for joining us and for your leadership on defense space issues. General Raymond, this is your first time before the committee, and I welcome and look forward to your input. And General Greaves, I understand that this will be your last appearance as Director of the Space and Missile Systems Center. Let me thank you for your service and leadership, and I know you will miss us immensely over here at the hearing rooms. You will soon lead the Missile Defense Agency, so we'll be seeing more of you before the subcommittee. Ms. Chaplain, as always, you and your team are critical to the work of this subcommittee. We rely heavily on you, and we are thankful for the advice you give us on space issues. It's critically important. Today's hearing will focus on 2 issues. How can the Air Force and the Department improve the way we conduct space missions, and how can we acquire space systems rapidly to meet mission requirements? Freedom of navigation in space cannot be taken for granted these days. Any conflict on the ground will quickly spread to space, and today's space systems are fragile. Prior thinking on how we perform our space mission needs to change and quickly. As General Hyten has noted, our disconnected operations, acquisition efforts, and resourcing hamper us today both in the Air Force and DoD as a whole. I hope we can change that sooner rather than later. I look forward to your views today in helping this subcommittee address these pressing issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Donnelly. We will now turn to our witnesses for their opening statements, and your full remarks will be put into the record. I would like to welcome Secretary Wilson. This is your first official hearing, and we appreciate you being here today. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you for putting our statement in the record. General Goldfein and I will highlight a few key points, and then we look forward to taking your questions. It's obvious, but it's probably worth repeating, that the U.S. is heavily dependent upon space, and our adversaries know it, and they know it is a vulnerability. In any conflict, space will be contested, and we haven't always assumed that in the past. And so there is really underway, and has been for some time now, certainly since 2007, a change in culture, a change in planning and training going on in the United States military, because we cannot take space dominance for granted. The second major thing is that since, this is now less than 24 hours since I was sworn into office, but over the last week since the United States Senate voted on my confirmation, I've been rolling up my sleeves pretty seriously every day and getting reacquainted with the space programs, which I had not been read into since serving on the Intelligence Committee in the House. While there is a lot more to do, I will tell you that I've been initially pleased by some of the things I see on what the Air Force is doing to improve training, to identify gaps, to experiment with new concepts of operations, particularly in the last 18 to 24 months. There's a great deal that is going on with respect to addressing the needs of the nation to be able to prevail in space. So I think you should know that from me, coming back into the national security business. With respect to acquisition, we also have a lot of equipment and services that are going to be bought for space in the next few years. It's a very heavy agenda, very heavy menu that we're going to have to go through. And I wanted to personally thank you for giving authority back to the Air Force for acquisition, because we do need to clean these things up. I think it's going to help. And we are working in the Department of Defense to implement the changes which you authorized so we can get the capabilities that we need on time and on budget. Those changes are not yet fully implemented, and it's one of the priorities with respect to organizing the mission in the Air Force and getting those things done. Finally, timing is not exactly ideal in the sense, for this hearing, in the sense that the full budget rollout will be next week, but I expect an increase in space expenditure from FY17, and what we cannot accommodate will, of course, appear on the unfunded priorities list. One of the great things about being a new secretary with an interest in space is that it's a team that gets things done. And I am pleased to be here today with an exceptional team of leaders in space, and that starts out with an exceptional chief of staff. And I turn it over to General Goldfein.
Thanks,
Thank you, Madam Secretary. General.
Thanks, Chairwoman Fisher and Ranking Member Donnelly. Thanks for holding this important and timely hearing. And I can't tell you what an honor it is to sit here with Dr. Wilson, our 24th Secretary of the Air Force, 24 hours after she was sworn in. And I just tell you that she gives new meaning to one of my favorite quotes, "Fights on." Along with General Raymond and Lieutenant General Greaves, we really appreciate you holding this hearing. As the Air Component Commander in Central Command some years ago, one of my assigned missions from the combatant commander, who at the time was General Jim Mattis, was to be his space coordinating authority. It was my responsibility to first understand his space requirements and those of my fellow component commanders from the Navy, the Army, the Marines, the SOF, Coast Guard, and our interagency and allied partners across the region, and to ensure their mission needs were being covered by capabilities provided by 14th Air Force and U.S. Strategic Command. It was a natural fit because I had the only headquarters in the region with the ability to coordinate space activity in support of combatant command and commander operations. And today's air component commanders in all of our COCOMs are performing this space coordinating authority duty from their air and space operations centers. So it's this experience employing space capabilities in combat that frames how I see my responsibilities today, first as a member of the Joint Chiefs and also as a service chief. As a Joint Chief, I have a responsibility to work with the Chairman, my fellow Joint Chiefs, and our interagency partners to understand their requirements and ensure they are appropriately represented in all space activities. As the service chief with responsibility for over 90% of the space enterprise, I have an obligation to work with Secretary Wilson to organize, train, equip, and present ready forces to the combatant commander, General John Hyten, so he can fight should a war either start or extend into space. Space superiority, like air superiority, is not an American birthright. It requires vigilance and action. We have many more steps ahead of us, but America's airmen remain committed to evolving our space organization, strategy, requirements, architecture, and forces to adapt to the new reality that you laid out and ensure we gain and maintain air and space superiority. As Secretary Wilson has stated, we have accomplished a great deal in the last few years. The Air Force has streamlined decision-making for the space enterprise. We're normalizing, integrating, and elevating space, building on over 60 years of space operations experience. However, there's much more work to be done, and we look forward to working with this committee and our interagency partners to strengthen our competitive advantage in this critical domain. Our legacy includes Benny Schriever, the father of Air Force Space, Thomas White, our fourth Chief of Staff, Jerome O'Malley, the leader most responsible for Space Command, Tom Moorman, Kevin Chilton, Bob Kaler, Susan Helms, John Hyten, all space giants. This has been our business since 1954. We will own the high ground. Thank you again for holding this hearing, and we look forward to your questions.
Before we begin, General, I would like to thank you for your recent column on our nuclear modernization. That was, it was needed, and it is something that Senator Donnelly and I believe is very, very important. So thank you for putting that out. We will begin the first round of questioning, please. And I would address this to the entire panel. How do each of you characterize the problems that we face with the organization of the national security space enterprise? Madam Secretary, why don't you begin?
Madam Chairman, as the Secretary of the Air Force, I am the principal advisor to the Secretary of Defense with respect to space, and I take that obligation very seriously. There are some recommendations that the staff has been working on with respect to how to organize within the Air Force on space, and it has actually been quite a bit of staff work done to make sure we're structured properly. I want to make sure that I review that well and get this right without signing something on day one, but I think there's a review underway of organization. In general, I think the Air Force has been doing this for 60 years, and that 80% of what the Defense Department does in space is the United States Air Force. And so we take the mission as a core mission.
Thank you. General.
Ma'am, I would say that right now we're in a strategic shift from treating space as a benign domain from which we monitor, sense, and report into a warfighting domain from which we fight should a war start in space or extend into space. And so where we are focused as a service and as a department is in 4 key areas that we're looking at, and all of them are linked when you look at the enterprise as we go forward. The first element we're focused on is how do we ensure that we have good, solid strategy and policy that we get, that we then as a service can act upon, and we as Joint Chiefs can act upon. From good strategy and policy, how does that actually then derive into a concept of operations, a warfighting CONOPS, if you will, that's written in the business of joint warfighting, that's not unique and different because it's space, but it's integrated and normalized because we actually know how to fight in all of these domains. From that CONOPS derives solid requirements. And with those requirements, we then have to acquire at a pace that takes us, that will allow us to be faster than our adversaries who are all investing in ways of taking away our advantage. And the final element that we're focused on is how do we organize, train, equip, and present ready forces to the combatant commander so that combatant commander, General John Hyten in this case, can fight should a war extend into space. So this is about looking at each of those elements, looking at the entire space enterprise, and looking at how do we move it forward in an integrated way as we shift to a warfighting domain.
Thank you. General Raymond?
Thank you. I would just add, I agree with the framework that General Goldfein laid out. I think operationally we're very sound. We have the world's best space forces, and that shouldn't be lost on anybody. I do think, though, that with what we see as the domain becoming a contested domain, we have to have the ability to move fast. And that's where my focus has been, to make sure that we have both the operational policies, processes, and procedures and the acquisition capabilities to move fast.
Thank you. Ms. Chaplin?
Yes, as you know, I look at things from an acquisition perspective, so I might have a different point of view, but for acquisition, that's all about staying ahead of the curve, being agile, and being as fast as you can to delivery. And in that regard, we do see a lot of organizational challenges that need to be addressed. There's fragmentation in leadership for space acquisitions, no clear point of accountability or authority. When it comes to very complex efforts like the GPS system, you have the military services involved, you have the Air Force involved in delivering a satellite, you have ground systems. It's an extremely complex situation where you need a clear line of authority to prioritize systems, lay out clear plans, and we don't have that yet. And as a result, you have pretty big gaps between the delivery of satellites and the delivery of ground. You essentially waste capability in space when you do that. So the fragmentation is a big issue in terms of our ability to stay ahead of the curve. Within that structure, we often hear that there's too many people down the acquisition line that can say no, and that the process is not streamlined enough. Some of those issues are common to all weapon systems, but they're very particularly evident in space because you actually have more players involved with the space system and more players just even involved with the acquisition process.
Thank you. General Greaves?
Madam Chairwoman, in addition to what Secretary Wilson, the Chief of Staff Goldfein, and General Raymond commented on, I would only like to add that our decision-making process is what we are currently addressing to ensure that we can streamline it and make decisions affecting the acquisition timeline in a quicker manner. Thank you.
I would put this question out to any of you that would like to respond. Do you feel that there are criticisms that are being made on the structure that you think are unjustified? General Goldfein?
Ma'am, I'm not sure I would say they were unjustified. I will tell you this, that right now, as we make this transition from a benign to a warfighting environment, I would just offer to you that any move that actually ends up in separating space as opposed to integrating space, I would argue is a move in the wrong direction. Because if I was the Chief of Naval Operations, the Chief Staff of the Army, and my fellow Joint Chiefs, and I was sitting here, I would tell you for all of the missions that we as Joint Chiefs do in the business of combined arms against an enemy, space is absolutely essential to every one of our missions. So the last thing we want to do is actually separate space into something unique and different with its own unique lexicon. Right now, where we're focused is how do you further integrate it, and then how do you take the tried and true methods of joint warfighting, apply them to the space domain, and ensure that it's normalized across all of these mission sets. So it's not really that it's an unjustified criticism. I just want to make sure that we're moving the nation in the right direction, which is to integrate space.
And do any of you feel that there's been any issues in prior studies, like the Rumsfeld Commission, that may have been missed, overlooked, left out? Madam Secretary.
Madam Chairman, some of the recommendations for action in these different reports are actually contrary to each other. And the structure of acquisition and operations that it currently exists with space was a recommendation of the Rumsfeld Commission, which was then implemented. Some of the other recommendations are not consensus recommendations. And so these are controversial and difficult issues, and I don't think we should shy away from that. We should We should analyze them clearly and try to look at what the enterprise needs now and structure in order to achieve that. And I think General Goldfein is right. We need to make sure that space is fully integrated and rapidly available. You think about this, what happened last weekend. This country had between 5 and 8 minutes to identify and characterize a launch from North Korea, and then to decide what to do about it. That has to be integrated, and we have to do this along the lines we've done joint warfighting since Goldwater-Nichols.
Thank you very much. Senator Donnelly.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Wilson, Air Force Space Command is responsible for training and equipping our airmen to perform the Air Force's space mission. But the command doesn't have authority for setting requirements and overseeing acquisition related to their mission. Is that a problem?
Senator, I don't think the current structure is a problem. It's a result of one of the recommendations of the Rumsfeld Commission that was implemented by the Air Force. That said, you constantly review organizational structures based on the needs at the time, and perhaps General Greaves or General Raymond might have something to add to that.
Great.
Senator, I would add that having the acquisition element within Air Force Space Command is a great advantage. And having my position report directly to the four-star Air Force Space Command is a great advantage, because by working for him, the requirements that are generated at Air Force Space Command immediately flow down to the Space and Missile Systems Center, which we then work with the command to turn into contracts to produce capability while working with Headquarters Air Force. So I see that as an advantage.
Okay.
I would pile on. I do have requirements responsibility. I'm the requirements officer, if you will, for Air Force Space Command, and working through the chief as Air Force requirements officer. I provide General Greaves with those requirements. I provide them with resources. I provide them with manpower. And I have a pretty strong voice in that chain. Although I am not in the acquisition chain or machine, if you will, I influence that pretty significantly, and have been able to do so on several big programs over the first 7 months of my time in command.
Okay. Thank you. General Goldfein, some space advocates these days are calling for a Space Corps, something like the structure of the Marines within the Navy. Do you support that, or do you think we should take a pass?
Sir, I don't support it at this time in our history based on where we are in this transition from a benign environment to a warfighting domain. I will tell you that, my sense is that we have an opportunity being placed in front of us right now to take a look at what is the way we fight in the air, on land, at sea, and we know how to do this business. And now how do we take those processes, procedures, tactics, techniques, and actually apply them across the space domain? And so right now, to get focused on a large organizational change would actually slow us down right now. Whether there's a time in our future when we want to take a look at this again, I would say that we probably ought to keep that dialogue open. But right now, I think would actually move us in the wrong direction and slow us down from where we need to go.
Okay. General Greaves, one of the lesser-known space missions for the Air Force is providing unique weather data for military needs. For the past several years, this committee has expressed concern about the Air Force's impending gaps in EO/IR Sensa data for cloud cover and theater weather imagery, particularly over the CENTCOM area of responsibility in the Indian Ocean. The plan seems to change every year. What is it currently?
Thank you, Senator. As part of the acquisition responsibilities at SMC, we've got a range of authorities that we can draw on. And we've listened to the feedback from the Congress, and working with General Hyten at STRATCOM, we've developed a plan to use one of the authorities that fall under SMC, Operationally Responsive Space, ORS, to use those authorities to speed the delivery of an interim capability to address gaps 1 and 2, the theater weather imagery and cloud cover. So that's in work as we speak.
It's my understanding that the available GOES assets are aging, and that they'll provide a short-term solution right now to the problem. The Air Force acquisition plans include a longer-term solution to meet CENTCOM's needs, something along the lines of 10 to 15 years or more.
That is correct.
Okay. Thank you. Ms. Chaplain, what have your findings been on the Air Force's long-term weather acquisition plan?
Weather's actually a good illustration of some of these problems we talk about with fragmentation. They've been very slow to actually study what's ahead for weather, and some of that study process was hampered by the lack of coordination with agencies, principally NOAA. That led to an incorrect assumption about the availability of European satellites, slowed the study process down further. So we have 2 to 3 years of study before we can even start a new program. There's still a lot of uncertainty ahead. That's where we're at. We're just kind of waiting to see what they do, but the decision-making process has been very slow.
General Raymond, do you believe Space Command should become a functional component of the U.S. Strategic Command so that the Air Force Space Mission is part of the warfighting responsibility of STRATCOM?
I absolutely do. That's part of a larger command and control restructure at STRATCOM. I served previously at STRATCOM. General Hyten is the STRATCOM commander. Today has about 18 different component commands, ranging from an 06 to a 4-star general. This is going to streamline that. It's going to elevate the operational commander from a 3-star for space from a 3-star to a 4-star. Align that with me. Aligns the service component responsibilities with the forces component responsibilities. Strengthens my voice in joint requirements, and I'm fully supportive.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Rounds.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, thank you all for your service to our country. Secretary Wilson, welcome aboard. It's great to see you at our first hearing. This is special. I have a couple of questions. First of all, I agree, General Goldfein, that clearly we will have basically a contested domain in space. And I'm just curious, the GPS, Next Generation Operational Control System, is an item that I think would be, or at least the GPS system which we have today is clearly at risk and would be an item to be targeted by any of our adversaries. Thinking of GPS and other data gathering or transmission systems that are in space today, we use them almost like infrastructure today. If someone attacks or could attack, and we talk about this being basically an area where we could fight a war, clearly we have individual nations in mind. Who are our closest adversaries with regard to having a battleground in space?
So right now, in terms of who we're watching and what their investment is, clearly those that are farthest ahead are China and Russia. And so they've been watching since Desert Storm. They've seen how we use capabilities from space. They've studied our reliance on space, and they're clearly investing in ways to take away that advantage. And beyond that, Senator, I'd love to get on your schedule to give you a classified briefing on a little bit more detail of what we're seeing.
I think the reason why I ask it now is because I think it's got to be made very clear that we have resources in space that they would try to deny us. And for one of the reasons that we're talking about it is we have, in the process, and in fact in a very challenging process, the GPS Next Generation Operational Control System. It's probably, as suggested by GAO, perhaps the most problematic Air Force program that we've got. A little over a year ago, General Greaves called it the #1 troubled program within the Department of Defense. The program is nearly $2 billion over budget and at least 4 years behind schedule. In October of 2016, the department completed a Nunn-McCurdy review and certified to Congress that the OCX was essential to national security, which I think you're reinforcing here today. No alternative would provide acceptable capability at less cost, and that the program's revised cost estimates were reasonable. I understand that the assessment from the most recent government review is that the program is making acceptable progress, but it is by no means out of the woods. Is the OCX program too big to fail?
Sir, if I could, I'd like, because you raised some great issues here about space resiliency. And if I could take a minute and talk about just basic defense of our systems and then turn it over to General Raymond and General Greaves on the specifics associated with GPS and OCX. We actually, as a service, know how to do layered defense of a critical infrastructure. If you were to walk to Bagram Air Base today, you would see a commander that can walk into a headquarters and have situational awareness on things that are going on out to 100 miles from that base and various layered defenses that we put in place, all the way up to at the wire and inside the wire. That's the same mindset that we have to apply towards layered defense of our critical space systems. And that's where we are moving out to look at that not only that layering, but also how do we build resiliency, and perhaps as important, how do we ensure that we train this force so that if a portion of that enterprise is denied or taken away, we can still fight and operate, and we do that every day. So this is about resiliency in the overall space architecture. And finally, I would say that you captured this right in that as you look at any space constellation, there are three elements that we've got to look at. How do we defend in a layered way? First of all is what's actually in space and what orbit we have to defend. Then you have to look at what has been integrated on various platforms that use that information, some that fly, some that run, some that steam, some that submerge. And then you've got to look at the ground control stations that receive that data, and all of those have vulnerabilities that we've got to protect. Okay?
So fair to say it's too big to fail?
Go ahead, Jay.
I would say no program's too big to fail. I will tell you that the mission is too big to fail. The importance of being able to access GPS 3 and the resiliency that provides is too big to fail. We have programmatically built off-ramps to be able to go a different direction if this were to not continue to progress. I won't be comfortable until that capability is operational on an ops floor. But it is a very important mission, and I will tell you we're laser focused on it to make sure that it materializes and then have alternative paths if they don't. And General Greaves can talk to you more about those alternative paths.
Yes, so Senator, this program is absolutely not too big to fail. In fact, when we looked at it as a department within the Department of Defense, late 2014, early 2015, we understood that this GPS 3 operational control ground segment was the first information assured, really hardened capability that we were going to deploy to protect against both the outside and inside threats. So we knew that. So we also knew that as we looked at the criticality of this system, we needed to build off-ramps, and General Raymond mentioned some of those, and we had milestone-driven off-ramps. So we looked at whether or not, if the system was delayed or we had to cancel the program, whether or not we would have control over the new GPS satellites. So we entered into a contract with industry to develop a contingency ops capability, which will allow us to fly the GPS 3 satellites as legacy satellites. So that was one milestone that we made a decision on. We also had a decision to make on whether or not the Block 0 of OCX, which is used to launch and check out the satellites initially, whether or not that would remain on track. That has remained on track. It's going through final testing now, and it's going to be ready to support the first launch of next year. We also looked at military code, whether or not the delays in OCX would impact the deployment of M code, and we also led a contract to start that effort to ensure that would be in place.
I think, if I could, I don't mean to cut you off. I'm going to run out of time
Sure.
here, and I want to be careful of that. I think the critical part here is that we have a GPS system, which we rely on today, which I believe you would say is at risk. And what we're trying to do is to find a way to protect it. And this is one of those tools that is necessary in order to create our ability to respond and to fight the war that we've become used to over the last 25 to 30 years. Fair enough?
Yes, sir.
Senator, fair enough, and we aren't out of the woods on OCX yet, which is one of the reasons why there's a quarterly review at the Secretary of the Air Force level to make sure that this program stays back on track. So it's got a very high level of visibility and oversight within the Air Force to get it to his ops floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Peters.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to each of our panelists for being here today. I'll join in my colleagues in congratulating Secretary Wilson on her appointment. We look forward to working with you. It's great to have you here, and I will extend once again the invitation that I extended to you when I had the opportunity to meet with you in my office to come to Michigan, to Selfridge Air National Guard Base in particular, given the fact your father served at Selfridge. We'd love to have you back, and Just to put it out there, they are celebrating their 100th anniversary this August, so we will talk to your scheduler about a visit, which would be really wonderful. And I'm proud to say the Air Force Thunderbirds will be performing that day as well, so hopefully you can be there. I want to talk a little bit about some other threats that we face from space in addition to some of the military threats that we've talked about, and that deals with space weather. We've heard about weather forecasting on Earth, but threats that come from space, from the sun, particularly solar flares and potentially mass coronal ejections, so that could have a devastating impact on the Earth. The Senate unanimously passed legislation that I worked on with my colleague Senator Gardner in a bipartisan way to coordinate the various agencies that have oversight of this potential problem, from NOAA to NASA to Science Foundation, Department of Defense, FAA. This has a big impact from the Department of Defense perspective for situational awareness as well as mission planning. And we know that it's just a matter of time before a very big storm occurs. I'm happy to say the University of Michigan is one of the leading institutions studying heliophysics and the potential threat that this has. But if whoever would like to comment about the importance to the Air Force of having some accurate space weather forecast, where do you see us in that regard? Are you concerned? I've been told that our space weather forecasting ability is equivalent to our hurricane forecasting ability in the 1930s. Which was not that good in 1930, and if it's that way for us here today, particularly given the interconnectedness that we have and the fact that the electrical grid could be wiped out through a large part of the United States should the storm hit, what should we be thinking about, and does the Air Force have the resources that you need, and should we be thinking about adding to those if not?
So I just say thanks for the question. Space weather is very important to our operations, both in space and on the air and in all the domains. We take this very seriously. I would have a slightly different characterization of where we are in relation to the hurricane of 1930. We have space weather experts in our Air Force that sit right on the ops floor that we operate, and they provide us very timely information on space warning. We provide that warning across our forces. When I was deployed, General Goldfein talked about when he was the CFAC. When I was deployed as the Director of Space Forces, we had space weather folks there as well that could help us shape operations to be able to operate and continue operations in that environment. As you know, space weather goes through cyclical periods. The current period that we're in now is not all that high, but as you said, there will be periods where we will get increased solar activity.
And Senator, let me add that the Air Force is very serious about this, and we've been directed for every new space system that we're deploying to have energized charge particle sensors on board to help characterize the environment that those spacecraft are flying, which will then help with the modeling that we have to do on the ground to do predictions.
Right. Well, thank you, and I'll look forward to continuing to work with you. When I think the forecasting, the analogy to a hurricane forecast is a very large coronal impact like we had back in 1859, and folks at the University of Michigan and others have talked about that catastrophic impact. I think Lloyd's of London has made a risk assessment that if a storm of that magnitude hits, it would be over a $2 trillion impact to the U.S. economy, and apparently we missed one by just a few days, just a few years ago. So that's the area where we are concerned about and why this legislation has been moving forward to work with you on that.
I totally agree with the criticality of being able to do that right.
Great. Yeah, thank you. The other thing, and General Goldfein, you had talked about how the domain that we're dealing with now is different than what we had thought about it in the past. This is a contested domain that we have to harden our satellites. We're going to have to harden our assets that the Air Force has. The question came up from Senator Rounds and others about the GPS system, but that leads to a broader question, is that we have an awful lot of commercial satellites in space as well that are critical infrastructure, and that those would be considered particularly soft targets, I would expect, that an adversary could target. How do you think about hardening our space systems, not just from the DoD assets, but understanding that significant civilian assets also could potentially pose a real threat to our country if they're targeted?
Yes, sir. I think the first important step is to make sure that we acknowledge that this is truly a partnership, and that there are those that are operating in space beyond the traditional state actors that we were growing up with perhaps earlier in our careers. And especially as commercial gets more and more interest in space and is launching more of the smaller satellites, when we talk about it being more a contested and a congested place, that's probably what contributes as much as anything into being more congested as we operate. And, you know, there's a question of whether it's more challenge or opportunity. And I would offer to you that as we see space, as we see commercial entities getting more and more in the space business, there are probably more opportunities than challenges as we work with them in public-private partnerships, looking at potential for other launch capabilities, looking for the smaller digitization of satellites that allows us to actually get capability, actually leveraging what they're doing commercially that could actually contribute to military operations. All those things are ongoing. And for, you know, as a Chief of Staff of the Air Force and as a Joint Chief, I look at the public-private partnership opportunities ahead as we go forward in terms of continuing to normalize how we operate.
Well, if I may pick up on the comment that you made regarding crowded space, a crowded place up there with all the satellites. I guess my understanding is that India recently launched 104 satellites from one rocket. 101 of them were smaller nano satellites, including 96 from various U.S. companies and commercial enterprises. And I understand it took a significant amount of time to track and to find these objects, to keep track of them. That leads to the question of space debris, all sorts of things that are happening. Could you give me a sense of where we are in dealing with that issue? The Air Force, I know, has taken primary responsibility in tracking a lot of these objects. Should we continue to do that, or is there something else we should be thinking about, because this will likely accelerate in the years ahead?
It's another great question. That space is clearly a congested domain. We track about 23,000 objects each and every day, 24/7. We take about 400,000 observations a day to keep track of that. About 1,400 of those objects are satellites. About 75% of those are maneuverable. We see this is a CubeSat. You talked about the 109 that were launched on the one rocket from India. We're seeing trends of smaller satellites. This satellite goes 17,500 miles an hour in orbit. We work very hard to be that space traffic control, if you will, to keep the domain safe for all. On average, about once every 3 days, a satellite repositions to keep from hitting either a piece of debris or another satellite. On average, about 3 times a year, the International Space Station maneuvers to keep from hitting a piece of debris. It's something we take very, very seriously. And I'll tell you, the airmen and joint forces that are assigned to the Joint Space Operations Center out at Vandenberg do that work each and every day and keep the domain safe for the world.
Thank you.
Senator Peters, did you return that satellite? Good. We don't need another one, right? Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank the panel. It's a very impressive group of public servants and military officers. Secretary Wilson, welcome. We're all glad to see you here in your position, and you know, as I think you always hear this from different senators, like Senator Peters, I look forward to you coming up to Alaska. You'll see that we're the hub of air combat power for the Asia Pacific and the Arctic, and training with J-Park, and the young men and women in the Air Force in my state, as you know, have been very busy. 5 F-22 intercepts of Russian Bear bombers just within the last month. So they're doing a good job protecting American sovereignty and airspace. So thank you for the great leadership all of you are doing with regard to the young men and women who are doing such a great job. You know, we're also the cornerstone of our nation's missile defense up in Alaska. And I wanted to talk a little bit about missile defense and what we can be doing better on that. You know, it's become very clear, and you were talking about the test by North Korea this past weekend, but all the public testimony is it's not a matter of if, but when Kim Jong-un is going to be able to range the United States, not just Alaska and Hawaii, but the lower 48 with an intercontinental ballistic nuclear missile. That's going to happen at some point. He's going to have that capability. And I think that we need to do more to be able to protect the homeland, to be able to say that if you launch 1 or 2 or 3 of these missiles, that we'll have a 99% chance of shooting them down, and then we will massively retaliate against you, which I think will keep even a crazy guy a little bit more sane in terms of trying to do something like that. But I don't think we're there yet, and so I think we need to do more, and I'm going to be introducing a bill that we've been working on for months with some of the experts in Washington and other places on increasing our missile defense capability, and certainly going to look to try and make that a strong bipartisan bill. One element, actually a key element of that bill relates to the topic that we're talking about here, and that's space, and space sensors with regard to our missile defense. And General Goldfein, you articulated well the idea of an integrated and layered defense, but as you know, it's not just Bagram Air Base, it's actually our missile defense that we need to do that. So General Hyten has stated in testimony that, quote, the deployment of a global space-based sensor system with discrimination capability will be a critical component to improving the effectiveness of our deployed missile defense interceptors. That's his testimony. Admiral Searing similarly stated, quote, from a missile defense perspective, we have to develop a future operational space layer. Given where the threat is going with hypersonics and more ICBMs, this persistent tracking and discrimination capability from space is a must for our missile defense. So I'd like to ask the whole panel, maybe General Raymond, starting with you, how would space-based sensors benefit our missile defense system, help with a layered and integrated defense, whether it's GBIs in Alaska or THAAD throughout the world, South Korea, Aegis ashore, Patriot? How is that important, and would that give us the persistent, unblinking eye and a stronger ability to have layered missile defense, which in my view we need today? We need it today, and we don't have it. How critical is space sensors in that regard?
I think it's very critical. I would agree with the previous testimony that you cited. I think space, if you look at the little handout that we provided and you look at the orbits, space provides persistence. Space provides that unblinking eye. Space provides the ability to discriminate, especially for maneuvering targets. We have a great partnership with MDA. We have, in your state, Senator, we have a missile warning radar. We're in partnership as we speak with MDA to modify that to be a more capable missile defense capability. So we've got a long partnership both on the ground. We have capabilities in space today with our space-based infrared satellites and with our Defense Support Program satellites, DSP and SBIRS, that provide utility to the Missile Defense Agency. But the layer that you talked about, I think, would be important, would give you persistence, field of view, and the ability to discriminate.
Anyone else want to comment on that, General Greaves? Or? Yep. Go
Senator,
ahead.
I will agree entirely with General Raymond. The Space and Missile Systems Center has been in very close contact with the Missile Defense Agency over the past few years, understanding where we can partner and where space can benefit. Space offers the opportunity from its vantage point for the promise of birth-to-death tracking, which aids in the discrimination problem that is at the central core of the efficient use of our interceptors. And we've been working, some of it is classified with MDA, to hopefully jointly determine what would benefit the missile defense mission as well as the space surveillance mission within the Air Force. So that work is ongoing.
Great. Well, I think I'm not going to presume that you'll support this bill, but from the testimony, I think you'll appreciate what we're trying to do here in the Senate. Ms. Chappell?
Yes, I also oversee our missile defense work. The capability that you're talking about, there's been a requirement for that since the 1990s, and there's been several attempts to actually build that constellation. One issue is it's very expensive to get that capability because it's usually in low Earth orbit and you have to put up more satellites. One issue that's sort of been recurring is
just to make a point on that, we've been looking at some of the costs, and my view is buying insurance with regard to a nutcase who wants to try to nuke Chicago at some point or threaten to do it the expense shouldn't be our first priority. Defending the nation should be our first priority. I understand we have the capability to do it, and I think, as you've been talking about, we've been talking about it since the 1990s. This bill is meant to say, let's do it.
Right.
Enough talk. We have a threat. We have a threat, a real threat, right now. A madman possibly could be threatening 300 million people in the next year or two with an intercontinental nuclear ballistic missile. And so I just get a little tired of the discussion about, well, it's going to cost a little bit more. I think the average American would take that insurance policy in a heartbeat to say, we have a 99% chance of shooting down a missile, when right now we don't. And the number that, I don't know exactly what you believe the number is in terms of our chances, but we need to up the chances and the probability of being ready to take out any threat that this guy daily threatens our country with. And we shouldn't take those threats lightly.
I think, given the expense, though, you can maximize that satellite's use by bringing in other requirements. One up for discussion is space situational awareness. If the same satellite can serve different communities, it helps you be able to pay for that mission even more.
And we're working very closely with the Missile Defense Agency towards that end.
Great. Madam Secretary, any comments on that?
Senator, I would just say one thing. You've highlighted the need to do more. All of these things and other missions for the Air Force, we're not going to be able to meet the needs of the nation unless we figure out a way to get beyond the Budget Control Act. And that's going to require a lot of work between the Congress and the administration to figure that out.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Wilson, General Goldfein, in your testimonies, you state that current policy does not fully address space deterrence and requirements for action in the 21st century. And given the reliance we have today, and it's been discussed by a number of you, for space for secure communications, intelligence collection, missile defense, GPS, and many other missions, what are your thoughts on whether it's time for the United States to engage in an international conversation about an international space code of conduct, and whether we should be negotiating with other nation states on such a thing? Secretary.
Senator, that's probably a policy issue far beyond the Air Force. The Air Force's role will be to be ready to defend what we believe will be a contested environment irrespective of any international norms of behavior. I think the Air Force intends to and does comply with international norms of behavior, and in fact enables a lot of those norms by providing information on where debris is and so on and so forth. But we must assume.
Thoughts on potential pitfalls or potential advantages of having such a code of conduct in place?
Senator, I have to say that from an Air Force perspective, I think what we have to do is to be able to prevail in what will inevitably be a contested environment, irrespective of consensus on international norms, because there will be players who don't abide by those norms.
Yeah, it's about risk mitigation more than anything else. That's why I asked the question. General?
Yeah, thanks, Senator. You know, in some ways, the intent of the National Space Defense Center when it began was actually take a look at how do we coordinate our activity beyond just the Department of Defense for other operations that are taking place in space. Right now, it's centered on defense and intelligence, and taking a look at not so much on who commands and who controls, but actually how do we coordinate our activity. And, you know, an international set of norms relative to how we coordinate activity beyond defense and intelligence is probably a reasonable dialogue to have, but I'm with the Secretary here, that's probably a policy level discussion.
So one of the GAO's recommendations is to delegate decision-making to the lowest level practicable. Do each of you agree with that recommendation, and do you think that this extends to the hiring of qualified individuals and the issuance of contracts? And I'll give you a little background. The reason why I'm bringing this up is that in addition to the delays in issuing contracts, I've heard a lot from recent graduates about significant delays, sometimes over a year, in terms of extending a job offer. Just last week, a number of my colleagues and I sent a letter to Secretary Mattis about direct hire authorities, urging that each of you help implement those authorities within the across the board within the Air Force, but particularly concerned about AFRL. So I just wanted to get your sense for how you view that recommendation and how far you think it extends.
Senator, in general, yes, the decision-making should be at the lowest practical level, and in that regard, I'd highlight the acquisition authority that was just recently returned to the Air Force, and we're working that through with the Department of Defense now. With respect to hiring, I'm not sure what the cause was behind what you identified, but remember, we also just went through a hiring freeze, and also an uncertain budget situation, and sometimes those decisions are based on the fact that we just have no certainty with respect to the budget, and budget certainty does affect managers' decisions.
Absolutely. My understanding is that was not the case, but we'll get you those details just so you fully understand the situation.
Sir, I'll let General Greaves and General Raymond talk to the specifics on acquisition and decision speed and decision authority. What I'd like to highlight for you is the importance of looking at this from both the requirements and an acquisition, because to acquire, you've got to start with a very firm set of requirements. Right. And here's where I think we have got to get to. The analogy I would offer you is that today we're building a tanker called the KC-46. We're not building that for the United States Air Force. We're building that for the Joint Force, because anybody who needs airborne refueling is going to use the KC-46 to include our allies and partners. Right. The chief requirements officer for the KC-46 is the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. And if anybody wants to change the requirements, they have to come to me to change those requirements. We have got to get to the same level of decision authority and deliberate oversight of requirements in the space business. That is the same way we acquire others. So as we work our way through decision authority and acquisition, there's an equivalent discussion we need to have about decision authority for holding requirements firm.
I would pile on that. I think strengthening requirements at all levels is important. I think the other piece of this that's important is making sure that we have the analytical rigor to inform those requirements. When we have that analytical rigor, we've been able to move pretty rapidly. And then I would also add that we are also focused on using rapid acquisition authorities more broadly than what we've done in the past. Senator, in your state, we have the Operational Responsive Space Office, and we're working hard to use those authorities more broadly.
Right.
Senator, as Commander of SMC, I think the single biggest improvement we can make, you've already provided language for us, but Secretary Wilson said, moving the milestone decision authority back to the services. And as the Secretary said, we're working within the department to execute that. As far as contracts, I know specifically with our advisory and assistance contracts, our support contracts, 3 or 4 years ago, there was a problem with those contracts. And within the last 3 years, we've optimized and consolidated the requirements process that generates those contract awards. And we've seen a drastic reduction in the time. We're not in the time needed to award those contracts. So we're addressing those. Thank you.
Thank you, General.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Warren.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you all for being here. Secretary Wilson, it's good to see you here. I hope we're going to get to see you in Massachusetts as well. You have a standing invitation to come visit our bases. Yeah, I want to make sure we get our plug in, too, for Massachusetts. So I want to talk about where we are right now with the commercial sector. You know, the commercial sector seems to be charging ahead in space. And one area where commercial advances have been astounding is in imagery. Today's commercial satellite imagery is often very high quality. They're even taking HD video from space. Meanwhile, our intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance is what I understand the Pentagon calls a high-demand, low-density asset, which means everybody wants it and there's not enough to go around. So let me start, General Goldfein, if I could, how is the department incorporating commercial imagery as a service into its approach? And conversely, how do you think about the risks that the wide availability of imagery pose for the United States?
Yes, ma'am. The reality is we sense the globe in 6 domains: air, land, sea, space, cyber. And then someone's got to take all those ones and zeros and turn it into decision quality speed, or decision quality information to allow us to achieve decision speed. Much of that falls on the Air Force. And we are continually looking at ways to integrate non-traditional means of intelligence into that sensing so that we can fuse that into this common operational picture. And I will tell you that we are using commercial imagery, we're using other sources that can bring, we're using social media in ways that we haven't before. And so this is a broader discussion about how do you leverage public-private partnerships and the commercial industry to be able to increase your decision speed and your ability to get that common operational picture.
So let me then just follow up on that a little bit, General. Our satellite programs are incredibly complex. They're also incredibly expensive. Oftentimes, a single satellite can cost billions of dollars. Meanwhile, the advances in technology on the commercial side are making sophisticated technology smaller, lighter, cheaper every day. A little startup company in Massachusetts can buy small, lightweight CubeSat. I think you said you have one of those here, for less than $10,000. And it doesn't cost much more than that to launch it into space. I get it that a CubeSat obviously doesn't have the same capabilities as the next generation GPS, but it seems like there are some missions that a smaller or less technically sophisticated satellite would do just as well. Maybe I could include you in this, General Greaves. How do you assess the trade-offs between large, technically sophisticated satellites and smaller but potentially less powerful constellations? How do you think about that?
Senator, we actually think about that daily, and it's part of our acquisition strategies that we develop. Just one example, one vignette. For the space-based infrared system that flies out of Colorado, we're setting up a data framework consortium to essentially go after commercial capability to integrate into our tools, applications, and processing lab to essentially ingest commercial data, whether it's imagery or OPIR or other sensors, and combine that with what SBIRS produces as an example, and exploit that and fuse it and send it out to users. So that's just one example.
Well, I have to say, I'm really glad that you're thinking about this and you think about the ways that you can integrate. It seems to me that a high-low mix of advanced and more basic capabilities in our satellite inventory would be a good way to think about it, kind of the same way we think about aircraft in this area. Capitalizing in advances, though, in technology is possible only if we can afford to do it. But, Ms. Chaplin, a lot of our space acquisitions seem to remain bogged down. Last year, the GAO reported that several of the department's most critical space programs remain over budget and behind schedule. So, Ms. Chaplin, could you say a word about how the department, what it should be doing to stay on schedule and to rein in costs in this area?
So I think a two-pronged approach is needed. One, you really need to focus on the acquisition fundamentals. In recent reports, we're hearing issues about systems engineering, contractor performance, lots of management and oversight issues that seem to persist. So those really need to be addressed. And then on the second pronged approach, really looking at the fragmentation in leadership so that we can speed up decision-making, be more agile, get agreements early on. That doesn't really happen as much as it should on space. And then I agree with you about the commercial suppliers and can they be brought in to offer a mix of approaches. For years, commercial suppliers have always felt like it's talk to the hand when it comes time to deal with the Department of Defense, and maybe you've heard of that. And there's also a lack of contracting mechanisms to help them engage with defense, especially when it comes to things like buying bandwidth or something like that. The DoD has been trying some prototype efforts to be able to buy services better, but I think a lot more can be done to bring in that kind of innovation.
Good. I'm very glad to hear this. Obviously, the cost growth in satellites is limiting our capacity to buy what it is that we need to buy. And we owe it to the taxpayer, we owe it to our national security to get these costs down to a place that we can get the full range of response that we need. So thank you all very much. I appreciate it, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Warren. I believe we have some time left in the hearing. There might be other senators who are going to be coming to ask questions, so we will begin just a short second round if senators have a follow-up question, and I would recognize Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. General Goldfein, I just want to follow up real quick on a statement you made about the KC-46 and your authority on the requirements change. Was that as a result of the NDAA amendments just 2 years ago on acquisition reform to give the service chiefs more authority on acquisitions?
Actually, it did strengthen the authority of the chiefs. It actually, I would argue, also strengthened the accountability of the chiefs for having responsibility for assigning milestone decision authorities. However, the responsibility of the chief of staff of a service to hold requirements firm actually did not change with the law.
So that had
That's been the
previously
case.
existed?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. I want to go back to the missile defense discussion we were having. And General Raymond, you know, I was talking a lot about the space-based sensors, but given your experience, and again, I would open this up to the panel, and given the threat that's heightened that we're all acknowledging, particularly from North Korea, can you talk about why some of the ground-based radars like Cobra Dane and the upgraded early warning radar and the LRDR radar that we're implementing now are also very important with regard to our layered, integrated, and strategic missile defense?
I think that as you just ended the question, layered defense, that's really what this is. This is a network or a systems of systems. Every piece of that architecture provides advantages. From the space capabilities, as we talked about, you get the persistence, you get the field of view. From the ground-based radars, you get discrimination, a better discrimination capability. So there are a host of sensors that are positioned around the globe to be able to do that. They come together as a network to be able to fuse that information into a timely decision and be able to respond as a nation in order to do so. But it's not just one capability. It's the mixture of those capabilities that provides the national missile defense capability that we need.
So Cobra Dane, is that in good shape? How important is that to tracking North Korean missiles right now?
Cobra Dane is an important, let me just say I'm not responsible for the missile defense mission. But however, I will say that it is a very important missile defense capability, and I'd also tell you that we use that capability pretty significantly to do space situational awareness as well. I talked about earlier the thousands of objects that we're tracking. We use that capability for that mission as well.
Anyone else want to comment on those ground-based? General Graves.
Senator, I'd offer that the discriminating radar that's going into Clear Alaska is key to the future of effective missile defense, and I believe that's why Admiral Searing proposed that it be positioned there, because it's a mix of, if you add the SBX floating X-band radar, a mix of phenomenology that's used to characterize the threat versus decoys, and radars are critical to that.
Great, thank you.
The other piece of this is you also need, as we talked about earlier, when there's a launch, you have to determine really quickly, is it a regional threat? Is it a threat to our homeland? Or is it a threat to space? Or is it a space launch? And so those capabilities, wherever they are around the world, helps us discriminate against that, and then provides us the helps them form the supporting relationships to handle those.
Did you have a comment, General Goldfein?
So I was just going to say, in my role as the Area Air Defense Commander in Central Command and responsible for defending the Arabian Gulf from potential Iranian missiles, one of the things that we haven't talked about in this discussion is the importance of attribution and ensuring that not only do we characterize the missile very quickly so we can defend, but also that we can have unrefutable evidence that we can present that said it came from this country.
Right. Let me just ask one final question, Madam Secretary, if I may, just since the two leaders of the Air Force are here. How's morale with our young men and women in the Air Force for both Madam Secretary and General Goldfein?
Senator, I probably not able to comment on that yet in any detail because I haven't been out and in the field. But I have a rule that any day out of the office and in the field is a good day. And I hope to be out and doing things and spending time with airmen. I think my first opportunity to do that will be next week. And I've got a number of engagements in Colorado next week.
Great.
Senator, I'll tell you, my belief is that readiness and morale are inextricably linked.
Yeah.
Where we have high readiness, we have high morale. If you walk the line today at Bagram, and if you walk the line today at Kunsan in Korea, you're going to find high morale because they've got people, they've got parts, they've got what they need. They're flying at a high rate, and we keep them at a very high level of readiness. So their morale is very high. There's a bill payer to get that level of readiness, and that's against all the bases now who have to contribute forces, both personnel, supplies, equipment, and often aircraft, to be able to get that high level of readiness forward to fight tonight. Their readiness is at a lower level.
Yeah.
That concerns me because that's the force we're going to rely on if a contingency kicks off. And so where you have low levels of readiness, you're going to find low morale because a pilot who doesn't fly, an aircraft controller who doesn't control, a maintainer who doesn't maintain is not going to stay in this business because we're not giving them the opportunity to be the best they can be in their business.
Great. Thank you.
General Greaves, back to the issue of contracts for just a minute. I've spoken quite a bit in recent years about the significant amount of time that it takes to award contracts to small satellite businesses. And in New Mexico, the delays have sometimes extended to 1 or more years before receiving approval. You and your team at SMC recently announced a space enterprise consortium that would use other transaction authorities to help speed up that process. How would you describe the industry response so far to the consortium RFI? How will the consortium accelerate the solicitation to award timeline? And finally, I just want to say thank you to you and Colonel Antonin for your leadership on this issue.
Thank you, Senator. The response from industry has been enthusiastic, and by using the other transaction authority, as we have done recently with our rocket propulsion system work, industry sees, as you mentioned, reduced timeline, increased responsiveness, and ability to execute their business case. As far as timelines, the final coordination on the consortium direction is going through Headquarters Air Force today. We expect to release it in 30 days, and by the end of July to award our first contract. And that contract will be supporting development of tactics, techniques, and procedures in support of the space warfighting construct.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Cotton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I apologize for my tardiness. I was in presiding officer duty. It's very much a duty, not an honor. Those blue suiters know that it's like staff duty when you're a lieutenant. I understand, General Goldfein, that in your opening statement you spoke about the Space Corps, which is one of the approaches the GAO reported could resolve the fragmentation of to resolve the fragmentation within the DoD, the Separate Space Force, and you said that you don't support it at this time. Could you elaborate a little bit on the reasons for that?
Yes, sir, because right now, we're at this point in our history relative to the criticality of space, that we're evolving from treating space as a domain that's relatively benign, from which we report, sense, and monitor, to a domain that we have got to fight in should a war extend into space or start in space. So as we make this transition right now, and we look at our operating construct and normalized joint warfighting, I wouldn't recommend to this committee that we would go to a core right now, because anything that separates space and makes it unique and different relative to all of the warfighting missions that we perform that are reliant on space, I don't believe it'll move us in the right direction at this time.
Ms. Chaplain, would you care to provide any thoughts?
Yeah, I understand that point of view, and in our report, we laid out options. We didn't make a particular recommendation because we think, how it affects operations needs to be taken into account. But I will say that the solutions tried to date that don't separate space as people think it should be separated, haven't worked very well. And the reasons that people in these prior studies and even today believe that there needs to be some kind of segmentation is to protect the space budget, is to leverage expertise for the workforce, and is to really clearly designate who's in charge. So if it's not going to be that, it needs to be some kind of solution that does those things.
Thank you. General Goldfein, you mentioned the difference between the benign environment that we're used to and increasing in a warfighting environment, which your joint statement from all the witnesses says right there on page 2. What exactly is the risk that we face in space now, in layman's terms, so the ordinary American can understand it? Because I think most ordinary Americans do believe that space is a benign environment.
Well, again, to the average American who goes to an ATM and pulls money out of that ATM, the timing signal that ATM relies on comes from GPS satellites that are flown and managed by the United States Air Force. You want to take a look at not only how many activities are dependent, you can look at the transportation industry, whether you want to talk airlines or trains, it's dependent on that signal. So just from a GPS constellation standpoint, I would argue that globally, this is a constellation that we have got to ensure that we are monitoring and protecting. So when we call it a joint warfighting domain, the idea here is that we actually know how to fight on land, at sea, in the air, and we have tried and true tactics, techniques, and procedures. And so now is the time for us to apply those to the space domain so it becomes further integrated and normalized across how we fight. And so that's why anything that actually talks about the business of separating and space in the same sentence, I submit to you as moving us in the wrong direction. Anything that talks about integrating and normalizing space is moving us in the right direction.
And that threat to normal Americans about their ATM machines sounds pretty dangerous. Who would do such a thing? What countries would be able to, or what adversaries would be able to disable those satellite constellations?
So without going into, and I could come on and get on your schedule for more of a class.
No, I know who they are. I was just wondering if you wanted to say who they are.
So right now, in terms of who we're watching that's investing most in taking away our advantages in space, the two countries that are making the most investment in this area are China and Russia.
And is it the asymmetry that we face just inherent in our geopolitical situation? We sit here in the new world and we try to project power into the old world across vast domains, and therefore we're inherently going to rely more on the space constellation than any old world power like Russia or China will. Secretary Wilson, you look like you'd like to respond.
Senator, let me take that one. It's not just our role in the world, it is that we're really good at it, and hence we've become heavily dependent upon it, and when it was uncontested, that was a nice place to be. But our adversaries know it, that we are heavily dependent upon it and very good at it, and hence they see the vulnerability. So in any conflict, space is going to be contested, and we see the capabilities, and the folks can come up and brief you in a classified way, but it's also their declaratory policy. It has been publicly, the Russians have publicly stated that this is part of their declaratory policy to develop capabilities to deny us the use of space in any conflict.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here testifying. Secretary Wilson, congratulations on your confirmation and being sworn in. Thank you for your service once again. Just a minute ago, you were visiting with Senator Cotton about the threats from Russia and China in space, and indeed a couple of instances of potential conflict are Russia's Cosmos 2499, a kamikaze satellite fashioned to destroy American satellites, and China's Xi'an, a grappling arm-equipped satellite that could remove U.S. assets from their orbit. How serious do you estimate this threat is, and what can be done to protect our assets from potential hostile activity in space?
Sir, I'll tell you that we, as the service responsible for flying all 12 constellations and 90% of the architecture, we take this very seriously. And without going into any kind of a classified discussion, I will just tell you that layering our defenses and ensuring that we truly understand and can characterize the threat, and that perhaps just as importantly as the constellations themselves, the command and control architecture that we're building in to first characterize and then be able to get the decision speed we need to respond quickly, are all part of the space operating construct that we're working for, that we're working towards. And then I'd like to turn it over to General Raymond as well, who's really the operational warfighter in this business, because a significant portion of our effort is actually also transitioning the Space Mission Force into a force that has been focused primarily on monitoring and reporting and actually focused on fighting.
General Raymond.
Thank you, Senator. As I look at it, I have 4 imperatives. And in any warfighting domain, and I would characterize space as a warfighting domain just like air, land, and sea. In any of those warfighting domains, you have to have the ability to have the command and control forces in that domain. You have to have the ability to have space situational awareness or situational awareness in that domain. You have to have an architecture that's defendable. And you have to have, as the Chief just mentioned, professionally developed airmen that can fight and be joint warfighters. And those 4 areas are where I'm focused. We've made some pretty significant strides in battle management, command and control. We're working hard partnership with the National Reconnaissance Office and space situational awareness, and with other partners, including commercial space, in developing CONOPS on how we go about disaggregating that architecture and coming up with an architecture. We worked that very closely with the National Reconnaissance as well. And then on the space professional development piece, we are making sure that our airmen have the ability to participate in exercises, war games, go to the right training, right schools to be joint warfighters.
What vulnerability would we have to a nuclear device in a satellite? And what could be the potential harms to the homeland if a nuclear device were detonated in orbit?
So, Senator, I would say that there's a spectrum of threats that we would be concerned about. They would go everything from the low-end reversible jamming of communication satellites and GPS satellites, for example, up through directed energy, up through what we saw demonstrated in 2007 by the Chinese with a direct ascent ASAT, and then I would put at the far end of that spectrum a nuclear device that was detonated in space, which would have pretty significant impacts across our constellations.
Senator, I would add that our most critical satellites, those capabilities, they've been designed to operate through the environment you just mentioned. Thank you. In this form, that's all I can say.
And what would the risks be of an EMP from a nuclear device detonated in orbit?
Senator, again, it would depend on the type of satellite systems. Our big data pipe, wideband global SATCOM would be less protected than our most critical in satellites that are in the nuclear chain of command. Those would be able to fight through that sort of environment.
But we do have, it's correct that North Korea has satellites orbiting right now.
They have one satellite. I call it a piece of debris. It's not very useful. It's more of a statement that they've been able to put something on orbit, which is concerning, but I don't consider it a capability that provides them benefit.
What are the most vital steps necessary to protect our assets in space, to prevent the space architecture from being taken down?
I think there's a couple things you have to do. First of all, and what our plans are is to make the capabilities that we have today more defensible. So one thing you might do is add some maneuverability to a capability to allow it to be more agile. The other thing that we're working through is looking at an architecture perspective. How might you disaggregate, diversify? We had good conversations earlier about the role of commercial space, role of our allies, and how do you build that architecture that puts you in a position day to day to be more defendable?
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. I thank you all for coming today and being able to present and discuss this very important topic with us. And thank you all for your service to this country. With that, we are adjourned.